Arabel's treehouse. It had all started a month before, when a fierce gale blew down part of the Joneses' garden wall and ripped a big patch of tiles off the roof. The damaged roof could be fixed. Builders came and began slowly mending that, and Mortimer, the Jones family raven, loved watching the men at work, especially after they installed a great yellow chute like a giant tube of macaroni for dropping down broken tiles and rubble from the roof to ground level. It was Mortimer's chief hope that somehow, one day, he would be able to get to the top of that tube and slide down it. So far, the builders had not allowed this. But the garden wall could not be repaired so easily. First, lawyers had to decide whether the wall belonged to the Joneses or to their neighbour, Mr. Leggett, and until that was agreed and the hole mended, Mr. Leggett's giant rabbit, Hoppy, was able to come through the gap into the Joneses' garden whenever he liked. Hoppy was about the size of a motor mower without its grass box, and he could do quite as much damage as a mower. Although at least 10 years old, when he chose, he could be very active. Luckily, he was rather slow-witted and lazy. Quite often days went by when he forgot about the gap in the wall and merely pottered in his own garden. When he did come through, Arabel Jones worried all the time until he went back because Mortimer the raven hated Hoppy with a fierce hate, and she was obliged either to keep Mortimer indoors or to take him for long outings. If Mortimer and Hoppy ever got into a fight, Arabel was not at all sure which would win, but she was sure they could do each other a lot of damage. Mortimer was quicker on his feet and had a deadly beak, but Hoppy was much bigger and heavier, and the terror of all the local cats. He would suddenly turn and kick them with his hind feet. As Mr. Jones said, Hoppy could kick a golf ball through a bearskin hat. Not that anybody in the Jones family had a bearskin hat. So, one morning, Arabel's heart sank when she looked through the kitchen window and noticed Hoppy just outside, slowly munching his way into a clump of pink asters. Mortimer had not seen Hoppy. He was eating a favourite breakfast of his, fish fingers spread with gentleman's relish and toasted. They were not his very favourite breakfast, which was sardines coated with salt meringue and baked in the oven. But that, said Mrs. Jones, was too expensive and fiddling for weekdays. Mrs. Jones was busy at present trying to clean up the dust and the mess which the builders tracked through the house 4 times a day as they slowly mended the roof. "And now poor old Aunt Elspeth has to go and die and leave us the contents of her deep freeze, which I'm sure we don't want, whatever it is," she wailed, reading a letter that had just arrived on the mat. "Not that I blame the poor old lady for dying. She was 94 after all, but you'd think there'd be some person a bit handier that you could leave the stuff in her freezer to without having it sent all the way to London from Wales." "Well, at least we're getting the freezer as well," said Mr. Jones, taking the letter and reading it, "though Lord knows where we can put a second freezer. Have to go in the wash house, I reckon." "All we need is another freezer cluttering up the wash house. Not but what the one in the kitchen is stuffed to the hinges with food that bird fancies for a week and then goes off, rotten apples and mouldy doughnuts, I don't know." And Mrs. Jones stumped away to do the stairs with her Pixiette mini cleaner. The trouble was that Mortimer preferred both apples and doughnuts when they'd been kept for a week or two and gone rather furry. "Want to come with me in the cab this morning, Arabel, pet?" said Mr. Jones. "I've a job fetching a package from Rumstead Airport, so I could take you and the bird for a ride, so long as he behaves himself. That'd keep him and Hoppy from getting into a scrap." "Oh, yes, Pa," said Arabel joyfully. "Mortimer would like that, wouldn't you, Mortimer?" "Ah!" said Mortimer, peering into the toaster to see if there were any fish fingers left inside, which there were not. "I'll be glad when he's through that phase," said Mr. Jones, putting on his jacket. "Don't fancy my toast and marmalade flavoured with haddock. You ready, both of you? Hurry up, Mortimer." "I'm taking Arabel and the bird for an airing, Martha," he bawled up the stairs. "Mind you're back at 12 then, that's when the freezer's due," Mrs. Jones called down. "And Ben, while you're out, get some boards to repair Arabel's treehouse, and some wire netting." All right," said Mr. Jones. "Wire netting won't keep that rabbit out of our garden, though. He'll be under it before you can say Channel Tunnel." Arabel's treehouse had blown down in the gale along with the roof tiles, and she missed it a great deal. It had been a wooden platform with rails in the big pink double cherry at the bottom of the garden. In fine weather, she and Mortimer spent a lot of time up there. Arabel carried Mortimer up in a basket. He hated flying, and of course Hoppy couldn't get up there. Mr. Jones drove to Rumstead Airport, where he discovered, to his annoyance, that they had a new ticket system for the car park. You pulled a ticket from a machine when you entered, and you were supposed to put the ticket and the right money in another machine when you left. "Why do they want all those machines?" said Mr. Jones crossly. "It's humans what need jobs, not machines. I'll have to get some change before we leave. You best wait here in the taxi, Arabel, dearie. I'll try not to be long. We've got to hurry home because of that perishing freezer." Arabel and Mortimer didn't mind waiting in the multi-storey car park. Mr. Jones had left his taxi on an outside row of the first level, so she and Mortimer had a good view of the road below, where there was a sign that said "Pick-up Point." Mortimer liked watching the traffic flow along the one-way system and the huge planes that suddenly floated overhead, coming down to land. "Nevermore," he said each time, deeply impressed. It was quite early, and there were still empty places in the car park. Suddenly, after 3 or 4 planes had landed, the narrow street below became full of activity and commotion. First, a group of skinny, long-legged, black-haired men wearing white caps and kilts like Scots sprinted along and vanished into the car park entrance. Next came 2 fleets of police cars, flashing lights and sounding sirens. They were going in opposite directions and narrowly avoided collisions with one another. Some of them did not avoid collisions.
"My goodness, Mortimer," said Arabel. "Do you think someone has stolen a plane?"
"Ah!" said Mortimer. One of the skinny, kilted strangers had run up the spiral ramp and now came panting towards Arabel and Mortimer in their taxi. "Is taxi free?" he said. Arabel shook her head. "Does person need ticket to take car from here?" he asked. His accent was very foreign.
"Yes,"
said Arabel. At that, he turned round, pounced on a businessman who was just getting into his Rover, grabbed the white ticket from his hand, wrapped what looked like a piece of tartan blanket round the man's head, and with help from a skinny friend, stuffed the startled driver into the back of his own car. They jumped in and drove off at top speed down the ramp. "Ah!" said Mortimer, delighted. Now Mr. Jones arrived, very cross indeed, as he'd had a lot of trouble with the customs while getting the package, a box of rare orchids for a nursery gardener, and after that, even worse trouble with the ticket machine, which swallowed his £5 note and then lit up a sign that said, "You need assistance." "I don't need assistance, I need my £5 back," growled Mr. Jones. "It can't cost £5, not yet. I should hope for half an hour in the airport car park." By the time this was sorted out, the 2 fleets of police cars had circled the entire airport complex and were ready to run into each other again outside the car park entrance, just as Mr. Jones came out. "What is all this about?" he grumbled, as his taxi was halted by a roadblock of police motorbikes and rubbish bins hastily thrown together. "Hijackers!" shouted one policeman. "Stowaways! One of 'em's a bear!" shouted another policeman. "A bear? You've got to be kidding," said Mr. Jones. "Anyway, all I have is a parcel of orchid roots, a raven, and a girl who is my daughter, Arabel." The police were highly suspicious of Mortimer. "Did he come from overseas? How do you know he hasn't got rabies? Or psittacosis?" they demanded. "Have you seen anyone behaving in a felonious way?" "Certainly not," said Mr. Jones. "Mortimer's an English raven, born and bred in Rumbury Town. Now let me get on, please." Arabel didn't know what felonious meant, so she kept quiet. Mortimer said, "Nevermore." At last the police let them through, and Mr. Jones drove out of the airport by a back road intended for supplies, as the front entrance was choked by police vehicles rushing in all directions.
"Oh, look, Pa," said Arabel. "There's something that'd be just right for my tree house. There, see, by the side of the road. Someone must have thrown it away."
Yes," said Mr. Jones, slowing as he approached it. The thing was about the size of a double mattress, fawn-coloured. It seemed to be made of many layers of softish, crispish, stiffish material, all stuck together. It was very light. "Well," said Mr. Jones, after some thought and looking around him, "seeing as how no one else don't seem to want it, I don't say but what it wouldn't be just the job." And without more ado, he hove it up onto the taxi roof and strapped it onto the rack with a bit of cord. Then they drove home fast, for they were only just going to be in time to receive Aunt Elspeth's freezer, even without stopping for wire netting. The freezer, when manhandled with terrible difficulty into the wash-house, it was very large and exceptionally heavy, proved to be full to the brim with portions of Aunt Elspeth's homemade carrot cake. Wrapped in foil, they were still frozen. The portions were the size of bricks.
"When shall we ever eat it all?" wailed Mrs. Jones. "You don't like it, Ben, and Mortimer went off it unless it's mouldy, and Arabel comes out in spots if she eats too much, and I'm on Dr. Parkinson's short, sharp, slim-you-up system."
"Well, we'll think of something," said Mr. Jones. "Maybe you can have one of your ladies' coffee mornings." And he hoisted the fawn-coloured slab off the taxi roof and went to jam it into the crotch of the pink cherry tree, where it fitted precisely. "I'll nail it and put a rail round this evening. Don't you climb on it till I've done that, Arabel dearie," he warned, and went to drive a Duchess to open a public swimming pool in Kilburn. Luckily, Hoppy was asleep in his hutch, full of asters, so Mortimer and Arabel were able to have their garden to themselves during the afternoon. Arabel draped a blanket over the hole in the wall. At tea time, Mrs. Jones was all excited.
"Oh, such doings at Rumstead Airport," she said. "I heard on Radio 4 some old-time dancers pinched a plane from Eastern Crook and flew it to England." "Where's Eastern Crook?" asked Arabel. "Well, I'm not sure, but they managed to land the plane at Rumstead and jumped out and took another plane and flew off somewhere else." "Dancers?" said Arabel. "Then that's who those thin men in kilts were."
Mrs. Jones was not attending. She went on. "When the security men were looking over the stolen plane, what do you think they found? Stowaways, just getting out of the baggage hold. Imagine it, a man and his bear."
"His bear?"
"A giant silver something with 6 toes, and it's still at large," said Mrs. Jones. "Fancy, it may be anywhere. The airport's only 8 miles from here. You better stay indoors, Arabel, you and Mortimer both. That bird would be no match for a giant silver 6-toed Bihorian bear."
"What about Hoppy?"
"Hoppy can look out for himself. He's not our worry." And sure enough, on the 6 o'clock TV news, it was confirmed that the entire National Folk Dance Company of the small Republic of Transylvanian Kruk had escaped from their homeland in a stolen government aircraft, leaving the plane, which had run out of fuel, at Rumstead, and hijacking another, in which they were now on their way to Iceland, while 2 stowaways on the plane had emerged with their belongings and evaded the airport police for a while, but were now in custody after a fierce struggle. One of them was a man, one a bear. The man gave his name as Eril Tahul. The bear was a giant silver 6-toed Apusinian fruit-eating bear, once common all over the mountains of Europe, now very rare and extremely ferocious, especially if female, as this one was. The man was in Rumbury jail, the bear in the zoo.
"Just fancy," said Mrs. Jones, "all that going on at the airport and you never knew."
"Just as well," said Mr. Jones, flapping into his evening spy. He'd fixed Arabel's treehouse. Arabel felt sorry for the bear, shut in a foreign zoo and parted from her human friend.
"Maybe they don't even know what she likes to eat, Mortimer."
"Ah," said Mortimer, sadly. A month later, it was announced on the news that both captives had escaped. "Experts believe there must be some mysterious telepathic link between the man and the bear," said the newsreader. "For why else should they escape on the same day? Members of the public are warned not to approach them, as they may be highly dangerous, especially the bear. The man's real identity is still not known. The name he gave was false. Meanwhile, there has been the first free election in Eastern Crook for 50 years. The government has been overthrown." Well, that night, Arabel found it hard to sleep. She thought she heard a sorrowful voice calling through the streets of Rumbury town.
Wagina! Wagina!
Then she heard a small, sad noise which seemed to be in the garden. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. Mortimer was on the sill. "Ah," he said softly.
What's that out there, Mortimer? Is it a ghost?
It looked very like a ghost. It was a huge, pale shape, forlorn, wandering about in the misty moonlight. Now and then it let out a whimpering moan.
It wants something, Mortimer,
said Arabel.
It sounds dreadfully sad. Do you think it's hungry?
The builder's yellow waste pipe still hung temptingly close to Arabel's window, with an even more tempting gash in it, which had been torn by a jagged piece of TV aerial. The pipe was not so very steep after all.
It'll be just like going down a playground chute,
said Arabel thoughtfully. She put on a warm sweater and jeans over her nightie, opened the bottom of the window, and climbed into the hole in the big yellow tube. Then she let herself down by her hands.
If you come to, Mortimer, you must keep quiet,
she whispered. Ah! Then Arabel vanished down the pipe. Mortimer followed with a single, joyful, stifled as he shot into the dark. When he caught up with Arabel, she was under the big cherry tree, talking very sympathetically to something large and pale and sad, about the size of a petrol pump, and stroking it.
I feel dreadfully sorry for you, the only one left, and you don't know where Mr. Tahool is. Are you hungry? I wonder what you like to eat.
The white shape let out a mournful sound.
Oh, my goodness. You must be starving, poor thing. I wonder if you would eat carrot cake. There's some in the wash house.
The wash house had a door leading to the garden, and a spare key lived under a brick in case any of the Jones family accidentally got locked out. Arabel fetched half a dozen portions of frozen carrot cake.
Wait, you have to take off the foil. Oh, you do like it. I am pleased. You don't mind it being frozen? Maybe you like it that way. Maybe things mostly are frozen in the Apucinian mountains.
The newcomer was plainly ready to go on eating carrot cake for a long time. Mortimer helped too, recalling that at one time he had been very keen on Aunt Elspeth's carrot cake, until she came to stay and made it every day for 3 weeks. At last, the visitor gave a great yawn, turned, and climbed the ladder that led to the tree house.
Do you think that platform will bear your weight?
Asked Arabel anxiously. It did. It might have been made for the purpose. A snore came from above. Next day, Arabel said,
Ma, may I put my Indian tent in the tree house?
Oh, all right, dearie, said Mrs. Jones, who was planning a coffee morning next week to use up all that carrot cake. Only fetch it in if it rains. Now, where did I put all those paper plates and serviettes left from Brenda's birthday? The garden was all misty with September mist. The visitor was still up in the cherry tree, looking like the ghost of an iceberg. Nevermore, said Mortimer, really impressed.
I think she's called Wagina,
said Arabel.
But I think Wodge suits her better.
Hoppy the rabbit was squatting in the rockery. He was gaping with wonder. His 2 front teeth stuck out like prongs. He plainly thought the new arrival was the largest tree-climbing white rabbit in the world. He was quite subdued. Arabel had brought a wheelbarrow load of carrot cake, and she climbed with a couple of portions onto the platform.
"Oh, Mortimer,"
she breathed in astonishment.
"Oh, there's a baby now as well."
"Ah!" said Mortimer cautiously. The baby was unbelievably tiny, considering the hugeness of its mother. She was bigger than a church door. He was about the size of a dandelion puff.
"I won't touch him, Wodge,"
said Arabel, soothingly to the nervous mother.
"but isn't he beautiful? I'll put up this tent so people won't notice you in the tree."
Wodge and her puffball baby just fitted inside the tent.
"I wonder where poor Mr. Tahool has got to,"
said Arabel.
"or whatever he's really called."
They found out Mr. Tahool's name on the 1 o'clock news. "The people of Eastern Crook have elected a new president," said the announcer. "Replacing Mr. Aram Tosh is the well-known Crookian poet Bruno Copicinci, who has often been imprisoned for his liberal views. Recently he escaped from Crook with a bear, the last surviving specimen of the great silver Apucinian species, because he claimed the bear should have her cub in freedom, not under a tyrannical regime. Mr. Copicinci is a keen environmentalist."
"Poor man, and they took and stuck him in Rumbury jail," said Mrs. Jones. "I suppose he spoke only Crook and couldn't explain himself. I wonder where I put Grandma's recipe for shrimp salad. Oh, that's funny. I thought the builders had all gone, but there's one of them now, in the garden."
Arabel and Mortimer went out into the garden, only to find Wodge and Mr. Copicinci hugging each other in a frenzy of joy. "Cerca, harini iksan chipiyema," he said to Arabel, who was bringing more carrot cake, and he kissed both her hands. "Oh, cerca, cerca."
I'm afraid there won't be quite enough room in the tent for both of you and the baby," said Arabel. "But I suppose you don't really need to stay there. Perhaps you haven't heard that you are president of Crook."
"Oro?"
"You are president of Crook."
"Oro?" Luckily, at this moment Mr. Jones arrived back from driving 6 children to dancing class. "Who the blazes is that in your tree house, Arabel?" he said. "And why are Hoppy and Mortimer playing ring-a-rosy round a cherry tree?"
"Because the baby's so beautiful. This gentleman is the president of Crook, Pa, and I think you better find someone who speaks the Crook language so we can tell him they want him back at home."
Mr. Jones phoned the Crooken embassy, and Count Kupavaf, the ambassador, came, and soon had everything sorted out. Mr. Bruno Copicinci, after some explanation, at last understood that he need not wander through the streets of Rumbury town dodging the English police and calling for his lost bear. He and Wodgina were free to return, he to be president, she to live in the Apucinian mountains with her cub. The birth mat, which all silver 6-toed Apucinian fruit bears build from birch bark and acacia leaves, they decided to leave behind. "They wish to present the birth mat to you, Mr. Jones, if you please," said Count Kupavaf, "as a thank offering for your hospitality. They come here because the former Cricken government would put Wodgina in a zoo. This Mr. Copicinci does not approve."
"I should think not,"
said Arabel. A procession of 10 Rolls-Royces came to fetch the visitors away, and they were officially seen off at Rumstead Airport by a Guards band playing the Crooken national anthem. Hoppy and Mortimer had been so awestruck by the size of their visitor that they remained quite mild, even friendly, for several weeks, until the wall was mended. All remained calm in the Jones household, until the day of Mrs. Jones's coffee morning, when she looked into the freezer that had contained Aunt Elspeth's carrot cake.